Welcome to Doing Business in Africa. I'm Sue Bierkes, and this time we're in Mozambique. Known as the Indian Ocean's Pearl, Mozambique has emerged from a civil war lasting some 2 decades to become one of the world's fastest growing economies. But it's not without its challenges, and we're here to find out what's driving investment, who's making money, and how they're doing it. Coming up in the show, how Mozambique's attracted some mega investors kickstarting its economy after a 17-year civil war to become one of the world's fastest growing countries. Could energy be Mozambique's next golden goose? The global credit squeeze and high interest rates, how can businesses in Mozambique fund expansion? And a look at how a seafood company operating in Mozambique is catching some big contracts. And finally, why tourism in the country isn't just about pristine beaches and wildlife parks. When Mozambique emerged from a 17-year civil war in 1992, its economy was in tatters, infrastructure had been destroyed, and there was no industry to speak of. A peace deal brokered between Frelimo and Renamo put an end to the conflict. At the same time, there were some important developments going on next door. The release of Nelson Mandela from 20 years of imprisonment and the ensuing democracy provided the impetus for further regional stability.
Since the 90s, after the first general election, the multi-party system that was put in place has been recording an average growth of around 80%, which is due mainly to the political stability. So it is a multi-party system with an election each 5 years.
There's nothing new about rapid economic growth following peace agreements in post-conflict countries, but Mozambique did something a little different. It managed to attract the world's biggest miner, BHP Billiton, and Sasol, the world's biggest producer of liquid fuel from coal, who set up mega projects, giving the economy a boost with huge inflows of foreign capital. It's here at the Mozal smelter where more than half of Mozambique's export earnings are generated. It opened its doors in 2000 as the single biggest investment in the country since independence and was really responsible for putting Mozambique on the map as an investment destination.
A project like Mozal had a very important impact in terms of bringing or putting Mozambique in the world map in terms of destination for investment, because if a project of that magnitude could be kind of implemented in Mozambique in short period of time and enjoying all this kind of success in every aspect, that means that the environment is quite conducive.
Mozal is a venture between BHP Billiton, Mitsubishi, South Africa's Industrial Development Corporation, and the government of Mozambique. In 2007, aluminium from this smelter made up 61% of the country's exports. But decreased demand for commodities due to the global economic slowdown has seen aluminium prices drop by 20% over the year. Aluminium smelters are by nature power guzzlers and are set up in areas where electricity comes cheap. And in southern Africa, electricity on average costs a third of what it does in OECD countries. Mozal imports electricity from South Africa's power utility Eskom, which is currently suffering from capacity issues.
We have a long-term power contract with Matraco. Matraco is a joint venture with EDM, which is the Mozambican Power Authority, Eskom in South Africa, and the SEC, which is the Swaziland Electricity Commission. They also own the transmission lines from South Africa, which goes through Swaziland, through Mozambique to Maputo. We were subject to power restrictions following the power restrictions last year, and we've taken our power from Matraco from 950 megawatts down to 915 megawatts. So we've been subject to that constraint, and we therefore are operating at slightly below full capacity at the moment.
But BHP's biggest headache might just prove to be an opportunity.
This business is an energy-intensive user, and that's always going to be potentially the constraint. Now, I know that that's something that Mozambique is probably thinking about a lot. I know the Ministry of Energy are thinking about opportunities, and we'd love to be part of that.
Eskom relies on coal for 90% of its power generation and needs around $52 billion to pay for new power plants. Lucky for Mozambique, it's got one of the world's last untapped coal reserves in its northwest Tete province. Between Brazil's Vale, Australia's Riversdale, and India's Tata Steel, some $2 billion has been pumped into coal projects here. Mozambique hopes the exploitation of the Tete coal basin will make it Africa's second biggest coal producer after South Africa, and generate an annual figure of $1.5 billion when all projects are complete in 2015.
That is now enjoying significant growth, and it is estimated that both projects will contribute to almost about 7% growth in terms of GDP.
This investment, combined with donor inflows, could shelter Mozambique from the worst of the global economic slowdown.
Mozambique is vulnerable, being to the financial crisis, being a country that receives a lot of capital inflows, both in terms of foreign direct investment and in terms of aid flows. Now, in terms of the aid flows, the situation for 2010 seems very stable. In terms of foreign direct investment, Mozambique is in a very fortunate situation because on the one hand they are suffering from a drop in capital inflow. On the other hand, they had very large investments already in the pipeline, mainly for the exploitation of the coal in the Tete region. And this essentially has brought a big inflow in 2009 and will also in 2010 that will more than mitigate the impact of the crisis. So in spite of the financial crisis, Mozambique is still projected to grow around 4.5–5.5%.
Eskom's lack of capacity just might be Riversdale's cash cow. Not only is it sitting on 4 billion tonnes of coal, but it also plans to produce power at its Benga project.
We found that there was a massive shortage in the whole southern African grid, and that's been amplified with Eskom, the South African power supplier, who has been unable to keep up with demand and unable to keep up with the increasing requirement to have much greener power, which means upgrading power stations. So they now have caused a huge industrial problem in the southern African grid by having power shedding. So while we started this project as looking at it as an off-take for our thermal coals, the power components become very important, and we have now been granted by the government the tick of approval to develop the power station, and we've also been granted access to the grid.
Mozambique's government lures investors into economic development zones like Tete with attractive fiscal incentives like duty-free import of capital equipment and tax holidays. In the past, these agreements have caused some conflict between government and miners in other resource-rich African countries. But Mozambique's cautious approach to its mining laws seems to be paying off.
Last year there was a big crash in terms of commodity prices, etc., and most of the mines had to close, like in Zambia and elsewhere, because the new fiscal regime was not kind of supportive enough to make most of this project viable. And I think we in our particular case, we were a bit cautious, and I think the government was quite cautious about addressing these issues. And I have to say that we have a balanced kind of fiscal regime applicable to the mining sector.
Fiscal incentives are, however, a welcome boost for investors who usually have to pump in huge amounts of capital to develop infrastructure to transport their goods. Coal miners in Tete have access to Beira's port via the Senna Railway, but the coal produced here is expected to exceed its rail capacity, so Riversdale is looking at the Zambezi River as an alternative.
Once we, by 2016, get to the order of 20 million tonnes run of mine, we're going to be looking at exporting 10 million tonnes plus. So once we get to that stage, we really do need an alternative. So it's now close to 2 years ago where we started the looking at the river with the understanding that we would require an alternative to the rail. And we now have a very good handle on the river itself. We understand by working with North American and South American barging companies that are quite experts in this field, that we now believe that we have the answers for barging on the river, and that's going to unlock a huge amount of potential.
Even with these massive coal deposits, over 80% of Mozambicans live without electricity. While coal mining and energy projects in the north are vital to the country's growth, it's in biofuel where Mozambique is pinning its hopes, not only for local power generation, but also agricultural development. Only 6.6% of Mozambique's some 64 million hectares of arable land is currently utilized. By rekindling the country's sugar industry and modeling its biofuel policy on success stories like Brazil and Mauritius, authorities say Mozambique could produce over 3 million barrels of bio-oil a day.
I was the CEO of a national oil company, and I did pioneer some of biofuels project. There are problems with biofuels, I agree, but I believe for Mozambique, for many sub-Saharan African countries, there is a big opportunity in terms of developing the biofuels, because that will bring infrastructure, will bring market, will bring financing.
Using bio-oil locally could help buffer the kind of food and fuel price hikes the country saw in 2008. Another major source of energy security could be Mozambique's oil wealth. The National Petroleum Institute says investment in oil exploration could total $786 million by 2011. A major find would put Mozambique in another league altogether. But the dangers of relying too heavily on one or two commodities are all too evident in Africa, which is why diversifying Mozambique's export base is key.
The challenge for Mozambique is precisely this. It's increasing the number of products which it produces and exports. No country has really made the jump from a low-income country to a middle-income country without essentially going into world markets and exporting something. Also to add that Mozambique is incredibly privileged to be sitting where it is, next to South Africa. Essentially, Maputo is probably the closest harbor to the Gauteng and Mpumalanga regions. And also from Joburg, Maputo is in theory a very, very competitive transport route. This is a golden goose.
To create a diversified economic base, there needs to be an active financial sector. And for Mozambique, this seems to be lagging. After the break, find out why some businesses find it difficult to expand in Mozambique, while others are catching some new markets. Why you need to keep your feet on the ground when it comes to property development, and who says tourism in Mozambique is all just about pristine beaches and national parks. Mozambique's growth has been driven by political stability, foreign direct investment and aid inflows. But to make the domestic growth base for businesses, there needs to be a sound and active financial industry. At the moment, Mozambique's financial sector is still decidedly small and dominated by foreign banks.
The return on investment has been highest in Mozambique than anywhere worldwide in the last 2-3 years in the financial sector. So the profitability, if you will, of the Mozambique financial sector has been exceptional. Now, partially this is due to a yet small financial sector with 3 or 4, there is about 12 banks, but 3 or 4 major players that don't face very much competition. Partially is due to a situation where that allows these banks to charge fairly high fees by, in a way, regional or international standards. So not necessarily an efficient financial sector, but a highly profitable financial sector. And that is expected to lead to increasing competition. You know, if there are good returns, more people will come in and increase financial services. But in terms of access to credit, we're still very much behind. We're still very much where we were in 2003, 2005.
For Mundo's, a local restaurant which started out as a hot dog stand serving UN observers during the country's first elections, this problem is all too evident. The restaurant has grown into a household name in Mozambique, but accessing finance to expand into other areas like tourism is a challenge.
We're trying to get finance through the banks, and although our local bank managers here are very happy with the idea, obviously gets referred to England and Portugal, and they need more surety, more cash down from our side. Obviously, there's more regulations on terms of the bank side. The government's very happy to lend. Obviously, they want more business to grow, but it is an issue. We're finding it a bit tough to get a loan.
On the other hand, it's hard to blame banks for being cautious here when looking at the turmoil in the world's most developed financial markets.
The banks are always keen to fund new projects. We as one bank will go into syndications with other banks if we feel that the project is viable. And this is how we would like to grow our balance sheets. Our balance sheets allow us to invest into projects. I think sometimes the clients do say that the banks are restrictive, but let's look what's happened over the past year or so, where banks have become more conservative to who they lend to and how they lend it to and what projects they're lending it to.
The central bank has stepped in to address some of these issues.
The commitment from the central bank is that they will try to discipline the sector. They have issued a regulation that removes all kind of fees, commissions that are not declared that banks used to charge. So since the 10th of September, most of this, for any kind of whatever you check your balance, you will have to pay commission. Whatever you make a deposit, you have to pay commission. For other commission we're not even declaring. So the government is just putting more discipline on that, and they're trying to reduce the discount rate or the requirements in terms of reserves from the private bank into the central banks.
And banks have responded positively.
The reserve requirements have come down quite considerably since I've been here, which also frees up cash for us to on-lend to our clients. So they are trying to stimulate credit growth within Mozambique in Meticash. They're trying to steer away from foreign currency loans if possible, because there's a drain on reserves, but for us to lend into local currency.
But for some companies, future prospects for expansion and funding lie offshore. Meet Gavin van der Berg. He started his seafood company with a 100,000 Rand overdraft facility. That's just over $13,000. Now his company turns over 10 times that amount. He's taken advantage of Mozambique's biggest non-mega project export, prawns, and exports to Europe and the US. And he's just signed a deal with giant retailer Costco. He says even though the global downturn has hit the pockets of consumers, his products are still in demand.
There's been some very interesting statistics that have been done by the research companies in the States, and that's a lot of the people in the United States are eating out less, but they're buying in more of the products from the retail stores, etc. Las Vegas, for example, will always do well. It's just the nature of the industry. But companies like Costco, for example, are reporting an annualized 8% year-on-year growth, and they're not really affected that much by the recession.
For Ocean Fresh, neighbouring South Africa, while the biggest trading partner for Mozambique, isn't a major market for his company.
The biggest stumbling block that you've got is where you're going to market your product. 9 years ago, before the advent and the influx of Indian black tiger prawns into the domestic market, all the prawns and crayfish that you could get were literally from Mozambique. That market is now closed in South Africa totally. The South African consumer is after a price product rather than, in my opinion, a quality product, what we produce here. But we identified that area in need of development some 3 years ago, and for the last 2 years have been working on taking the product to a better market in terms of financial realization, hence the United States.
But there's no lack of demand by South Africans when it comes to Mozambique's unspoilt beaches. Since the end of the country's civil war, Mozambique has increasingly become a popular tourist destination because of its national parks and tropical coastline. In particular, it's attractive for South Africans. It's just a 6-hour drive from the commercial capital Johannesburg, making it ideal for a long weekend away. Swiss investor Adrian Frey himself came to Mozambique on a holiday just 12 years ago and has never looked back. He says it's not just middle-class South Africans and Europeans responsible for generating the $119 million recorded for this sector in 2008.
We have a new, very interesting group. This is the high-end group. These are the wealthy people of the world. Over there we have a development where the Prince of Holland is building a holiday home. Now with the Prince of Holland comes other celebrities as well, and I'm told that even the royal family in England is now looking into that. So all of a sudden Mozambique has a value for the famous and rich people in the world, and that's actually very good news for us, because these people then bring us access to huge investments and give us exposure in the world.
Adrian's story is pretty unique because during his time in Mozambique, he says he made enough mistakes that he eventually saw a business opportunity in them. He started consulting other investors.
When you come here, I think you have to control your budgets very carefully. It takes longer than a lot of people think to roll out here. 6 out of 10 investors fail, so one has to be aware that it's a challenging place where people also can fail. And the successful people are the people who came in very carefully, came here to study the market first, and opened their businesses with good advisors. You need good advisors, and then you can be very successful.
The big mistake investors make when trying to do business in Mozambique is not understanding its property law. Gustave Eiffel's architecture has 2 instances where they're particularly relevant for Mozambique and France. Firstly, because he designed 2 of the major architectural sites in Maputo. Secondly, because like the great con job attempted by Victor Lustig to sell the famous French landmark, property con jobs in Mozambique are rife.
It gets tricky when obviously the crooks try and get clever and try and sell one property to one person and the same property to somebody else.
Does that happen quite a lot?
It happens quite often, but con artists are all over the world. If you're going to do something in a foreign country, get a lawyer, a reputable lawyer, and do things the right way. I find a lot of guys come in here, they see a chance, get a hectare property for 5,000 rand. They take the chance, they lose their money because they don't go through the proper channels.
When you come here, you cannot buy land. That's forbidden in Mozambique. So what happens here, you get the right to develop land, and this right is basically given to you for free. And only when you have built on your land, you can sell what you have built. In other words, an empty piece of land is not tradable, and that's a typical mistake South African investors make here.
But for some companies, it's not just about getting property rights. Obtaining licenses for some unusual equipment is the major challenge. Maria Bagora and Kevin Davies started Mozambique City Tours to capitalize on Mozambique's vibrant city life, which is often bypassed for destinations further north. But they hope their unique hop-on, hop-off train service will change all that.
That was actually one of the reasons why we wanted to introduce this service, the city tour on a flexible hop-on and hop-off train, because we find that a lot of the tourists or the people that are selling, tourism in Mozambique neglect Maputo city a little bit, and we wanted to develop the urban tourism. The most interest that tourists have is for the north of the country, where we have all the beautiful and unspoiled beaches, but our intention is to also develop urban tourism in the city.
As Maria has hinted at there, the city itself has some beautiful architecture from colonial times, dating back to the early 17th century, and some exceptional monuments within the city that really are deserving of some visits and deserving of some exposure. And that was one of the primary reasons, because we don't want it to be just a stopover visit. When people are here, they should experience the cultural elements that the city's got to offer, as well as some of the great restaurants and the shopping opportunities that abound here.
Overall, Mozambique still has a long way to go before it becomes a competitive investment destination. But that's not to say it's not on the right track.
It's still an emerging market, but opportunity is huge in Mozambique, especially with mining is growing a lot. Agriculture, there's a lot of land available, fertile land. Infrastructure is getting a lot better. Railroads is getting better, the roads are getting a lot better. A lot of the roads up north have been fixed, the ports are getting upgraded. So in every aspect, I think it's going to take still a bit of time before it's probably competes with the first world, but the opportunity is definitely there.